Good evening. On behalf of the Newark Public Library, welcome to tonight's program, The Battle Over Women's Suffrage in Newark. This event is co-sponsored by the Newark History Society, the Newark Public Library, and Rutgers University, Newark. I'm Tom Ankner, the director of the Charles F. Cummings New Jersey Information Center at the Public Library. Before we get started, I just wanted to encourage you all to fill out your census forms. Filling out the census is one small but very important thing everyone can do right now to help our city and our communities. If you haven't done so yet, please go to my2020census.gov and fill out the brief questionnaire. The information you provide affects funding for healthcare, transportation, your local schools, and many other needs. Remember, my2020census.gov. It is safe, secure, and confidential. And since tonight's program has to do with voting, it is a good time to encourage you all to vote on November 3rd. We've been hearing a lot about the presidential race this year, but there are also elections for the U.S. House and for one of New Jersey's U.S. Senate seats. Voters will also be asked to weigh in on 3 public questions, including one on legalizing recreational marijuana. If you haven't already registered, the deadline is October 13th. Now, back to the battle over women's suffrage. We will have a question and answer session after the 2 main presenters speak. If anyone would like to pose a question or offer a comment, please type it in the chat box or the Q&A box. The cameras and microphones of all audience members will be left off during the program. Now, to introduce our 2 presenters, here is Timothy J. Crist, the president of the Newark History Society. Tim?
Well, thanks, Tom. We're pleased that this is the first of our 6 planned programs for the program year through next May. And we're delighted that this one about women's suffrage, the battle over women's suffrage in Newark, comes so close to the centenary. And let me add my thanks to the Newark Public Library and the Federated Department of History and the African American and African Studies Department of Rutgers Newark for co-sponsoring this. There will be 2 main presentations, and we've decided to focus on a couple elements of the women's suffrage story that don't often get a lot of attention. One is those who opposed women's suffrage, and then second, the activities of African American immigrant and working class women to push for women's suffrage. George Robb, a professor of history at William Paterson University, will start by reviewing the opposition to women's suffrage in Newark. George is also an officer of the Newark History Society. And then Noelle Lorraine Williams will follow by talking about the role of African American immigrant and working class women who in Newark or the Newark area who pushed so hard for women's suffrage. This draws on the work she did for the Radical Women exhibit that is still up and available for viewing in the Newark Public Library, and also on her extensive research as a graduate student at Rutgers Newark into the Black community in Newark in the 19th and early 20th century. Noelle is an artist as well as an historian, associated with both with Rutgers Newark and with the Newark Public Library. So George, why don't you get us started? And then you'll hand off to Noelle, and after that we'll move to the Q&A.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, and thank you for everyone for tuning in tonight. On this, the centennial of the 19th Amendment, there have been widespread and year-long celebrations of suffragists through exhibits, publications, performances, and memorials. An important component of this year's commemoration has been the recovery of forgotten suffragists from African American, immigrant, and working class backgrounds. And that's what Noelle will be talking about later. Less inspiring candidates for rediscovery are the many women and men who opposed votes for women. After all, history is written by the victors, and the anti-suffragists were on the losing side. At their best, their attitudes and arguments seem quaintly old-fashioned and amusing. At their worst, they are deeply misogynist and embarrassing to modern sensibilities. Nonetheless, the anti-suffrage movement played a significant role in the fight for the vote, often setting the terms of the debate and pushing suffragists to adopt new strategies. Newark was the center of the anti-suffrage movement in New Jersey. When the state voted on enfranchising women in 1915, the no vote was bigger in Newark than anywhere else in New Jersey. Newark's Democratic political machine led the fight against women's suffrage in New Jersey. And the Newark Eagle was the most rabidly anti-suffrage newspaper in the state. In Newark, the anti-suffragists were a loose, heterogeneous, and rather odd coalition of conservative women, religious leaders, corrupt political bosses, and entrenched business interests. Opponents of women's suffrage were most visible and successful in the 1910s, scoring their greatest victory with their defeat of New Jersey's suffrage referendum in 1915. The run-up to this October 1915 vote saw the most vigorous campaigns by anti-suffragists in Newark, as well as the greatest outpouring of anti-suffrage literature. While an organized suffrage movement began in New Jersey during the 1860s, its opponents felt no need to organize themselves until the 20th century. For most of the 19th century, women's suffrage was a radical movement outside mainstream politics and culture. Most clergymen condemned equal rights for women as a godless philosophy, and very few politicians were willing to even take it seriously. This is a popular illustration from the 19th century entitled Light of the World, and it kind of embodies the Victorian view of woman as the angel in the house. The 19th century American attitudes about women and the proper relationships between the sexes were governed by this idea, or often referred to as doctrine of separate spheres, that men and women had distinct God-given roles, and man's was the public sphere of work, commerce, and politics, while women were to uphold virtue in the home as wives and mothers. Now, organized opposition to women's suffrage only began around 1910. This was an indication of the growing strength and influence of the suffrage movement. Anti-suffragists were starting to get worried. They could no longer dismiss suffragists as an aberration or a joke. They had to get organized themselves. In November 1911, a group of socially prominent women from New England and New York organized the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. The association was headquartered in New York City, and it was led by Josephine Jewel Dodge, a wealthy widow. The National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage hoped to stimulate and coordinate anti-suffrage campaigns around the country by providing assistance from experienced organizers and speakers, and by publishing and distributing anti-suffrage literature. In April 1912, anti-suffrage women in New Jersey founded the New Jersey Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage as a state affiliate of the national group. The New Jersey Association was based in Trenton and led by wealthy white women, such as Margaret Bassett from Summit, Georgiana Breeze from Plainfield, Frances Cleveland Preston from Princeton, and Jenny Tuttle Hobart, pictured here, from Paterson. Preston was the widow of President Grover Cleveland, and Hobart was the widow of Vice President Garrett Hobart, who had served under McKinley. By 1913, the New Jersey Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage had 5,000 members. By 1915, it had 11,000 members, with branches in 34 towns around the state. These anti-suffrage women were drawn primarily from white, middle-class communities. Most of them were native-born Protestants. Newark does not appear to have been a stronghold of the New Jersey Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. The organization was more active in South Jersey and the suburbs. Nonetheless, there was a Newark branch of the Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage with headquarters in the Kinney Building on Broad Street. See pictured here. These are some of the prominent Newark women who were involved in this association opposed to women's suffrage. These women represent some of the most prominent anti-suffrage women in Newark. It's interesting, I was unable to find photos of any of them, and unlike the pro-suffrage women in Newark, you can easily find photographs of. And a lot of this has to do with these women, the anti-suffrage women. They kept a low profile. They didn't participate in parades or rallies. They worked behind the scenes. Most of these women were the wives or daughters of wealthy and prominent Newark men. Helen Darcy was married to a successful businessman. Sadie Foster was the wife of a rabbi. Laura Plume was the daughter of banker Joseph Plume. Mae Clark's husband owned Clark Thread. Louise Swayze's husband was a justice of the New Jersey Supreme Court. Estelle Frelinghuysen's husband was the president of the Mutual Benefit Insurance Company. And Mary Borcheling was the widow of a lawyer from Newark. And she is listed in the 1915 New Jersey Census as capitalist. Helen Darcy was the president of the Newark branch of the association opposed to women's suffrage. She held a lot of meetings. I wasn't able to find a photo of her, but this is her house on James Street. And she hosted many meetings at her home on James Street. Darcy and other leaders of this organization argue that women's privilege and power came from their domestic roles, and that women could exert greater influence by steering clear of partisan politics. Now, an organized female opposition to women's suffrage was embarrassing to New Jersey suffragists who preferred to cast their opponents as reactionary men. Suffrage women tried to discredit the antis as the tools of the liquor industry, or as privileged women who were out of touch with the needs of ordinary women. The anti-suffrage women in Newark also differentiated themselves from the suffragists by the tactics they employed. While a Newarker, Mina Van Winkle, president of the Women's Political Union, reinvigorated the suffrage movement in Newark by promoting street meetings, parades, and door-to-door canvassing, the anti-suffrage women in Newark prohibited outdoor meetings in their bylaws. The antis condemned public demonstrations and marches as unladylike, favoring more staid luncheons and balls in downtown hotels. Anti-suffrage women preferred to delegate men as the public face of their campaigns, while managing activities behind the scenes themselves. The New Jersey Association opposed to women's suffrage hired John A. Matthews of Newark as an anti-suffrage lobbyist and speaker. He was a well-known orator and a former Democratic assemblyman. Matthews energetically lobbied his former colleagues in the State House against giving women the vote. And one of the papers at the time referred to him as the silver-tongued orator of New Jersey. In New Jersey, the anti-suffrage women worked closely with the Men's Anti-Suffrage League of New Jersey, which was founded in 1914 to combat the suffrage referendum that was going to take place in 1915. Many of the members of the Men's Anti-Suffrage League in Newark were married, were husbands of women who were involved in the Anti-Suffrage League. They had their headquarters, the state organization had its headquarters here at the WIS building on Broad Street. The League's president was Colonel William Libby, who was a geography professor at Princeton, an officer of the New Jersey National Guard, and president of the National Rifle Association. In Newark, the most prominent member of the Men's Anti-Suffrage League was Joseph Plume, a wealthy banker and general in the New Jersey State Militia. This is a picture of him. It's a much younger man. By this period, he was quite elderly. Other Newark members of the Anti-Suffrage League included John Matthews, who I mentioned earlier. Also Henry Darcy was a businessman and was the husband of Helen Darcy, who was the head of the Women's Anti-Suffrage League in Newark. So it's like Henry and Helen Darcy were like the Newark anti-suffrage power couple. The leadership of the Men's Anti-Suffrage League, like that of the anti-suffrage women, were mostly white Protestant elites. Religious opposition to women's suffrage had diminished considerably by the 20th century. Politicians no longer quoted the Bible to suffragists, as they did in the 19th century. Ministers were much less hostile by the 20th century. You'd find very few ministers in the 19th century who were willing to support women's suffrage. Many Newark clergymen now, in the early 20th century, endorsed votes for women, including Joseph Twomey of the First Baptist Petty Memorial Church, which is pictured here, Charles Stewart of the North Reformed Church in Newark, A.W.H. Thompson of St. Mark's Episcopal Church, and M.L.A. Hirsch of St. Paul's Evangelical Lutheran Church. Most religious denominations avoided taking on official positions on women's suffrage as too controversial. The Episcopal Bishop of Newark, Edwin Stephen Lyons, urged his clergy to avoid discussion of the topic as potentially divisive of their congregations. The Roman Catholic Church likewise refrained from officially endorsing or condemning votes for women. Nonetheless, in 1909, Pope Pius X expressed his opposition to women's suffrage during a meeting with Catholic women at the Vatican. A number of Catholic bishops in the United States were also outspoken in their hostility. In 1915, the Men's Anti-Suffrage League of New Jersey flooded the state with a circular entitled Catholics Fight Women's Suffrage, which quoted several Catholic prelates hostile to suffrage and implied that the Catholic Church was officially opposed to the measure. The pamphlet quoted a letter from Bishop McFall of Trenton to Anne McIlvaine of the New Jersey Association opposed to women's suffrage, in which the bishop, quote, approved the measures you have selected for opposing the so-called suffragettes. Similar anti-suffrage sentiments were also quoted from a letter written by John Cardinal Gibbons of Baltimore. It was interesting, neither prelate had authorized the use of their private correspondence in this pamphlet, which was actually the handiwork of James Nugent, the Democratic Party boss of Newark. The pamphlet generated a backlash at a time in which many Americans still feared that Catholics took their marching orders from the Pope. The Newark Sunday Call condemned Nugent and the Men's Anti-Suffrage League for injecting religion into a political debate. The paper further doubted whether, quote, celibate Catholic clergy understood women's suffrage as well as an ordinary businessman. The most outspoken opponent of women's suffrage among Newark's religious leaders was certainly Rabbi Solomon Foster of Benigerun, Newark's largest Jewish congregation. American Judaism was not a unified or homogeneous entity. Some branches were more conservative than others. And in fact, most rabbis in New Jersey, like Julius Silberfeld of B'nai Abraham in Newark, actually supported women's suffrage. Foster was an outlier in his opposition, but he more than made up for this by the vehemence of his opposition. Solomon Foster testified against women's suffrage before the New Jersey State Assembly on January 28, 1914. And during the 1915 referendum campaign, he was a frequent anti-suffrage speaker throughout New Jersey, arguing that politics would distract women from their primary responsibility as wives and mothers. Women needed to do a better job as homemakers, according to the rabbi, before they took on political reform. Indeed, Foster actually blamed many women in New Jersey for a number of social ills caused by their inadequate housekeeping skills. And I won't read this long quote, but as you can see, he's basically saying if women did a better job of making the home a nice place, if they cooked better food, men wouldn't be tempted to go off to saloons. Now, I can only imagine what some of the women in his congregation felt about this. I don't think they were very amused by it, but I don't think he was consulting them on this. While conservative women and clergymen acted as spokespersons for the anti-suffrage cause, much of the money and manpower necessary for mobilizing the masses and getting out the vote from New Jersey came from New Jersey's business corporations and well-oiled political machines. Entrenched politicians feared that women voters would support reform movements to clean up government and end lucrative patronage politics. Business interests feared that women voters would support greater corporate regulation, restricting child labor, mandating better working conditions, and above all, limiting the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages. Breweries constituted a significant part of the Newark economy, and they employed thousands of people, as the Valentine Brewery pictured here as it looked in the early 20th century. In 1915, there were around 1,400 saloons in Newark. This is Nicodemi's, a saloon in the Old First Ward, an Italian-American tavern in the Old First Ward. Like breweries, the saloons opposed women's suffrage because they feared that suffrage would lead to prohibition. This was not a baseless fear, as many suffragists were also active in the temperance movement. The State Liquor Dealers Association and the German-American Alliance, which is heavily funded by the breweries, openly opposed women's suffrage. Enormous sums of money were spent by the liquor industry in New Jersey to defeat the 1915 suffrage referendum. Newark was placarded with the slogan, quote, "A vote for women's suffrage is a vote for prohibition." Anti-suffrage women, many of whom actually supported prohibition, or supported temperance rather, and the liquor lobby made strange bedfellows. And the pro-suffrage women in New Jersey tried to embarrass the New Jersey Association opposed to women's suffrage by pointing out they were allied with the breweries and the saloons. And so this is a cartoon, Mrs. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, in which the anti-suffrage woman is looking in the mirror, and what she sees reflected back is the liquor interest, the liquor lobby. Suffragists in New Jersey were further hampered by the fact that both political parties in the state were rather cold to them. Most notably, James R. Nugent of Newark was the implacable enemy of women's suffrage. Described by historian Sylvia Strauss as, quote, "the political boss incarnate," Nugent was the longtime chairman of the New Jersey State Democratic Committee. With a power base in Newark and Essex County, Boss Nugent ran a corrupt political patronage machine that controlled access to jobs and lucrative construction contracts. Like other urban political bosses of the day, Nugent expected kickbacks from his clients and traded votes for money. He was an Irish immigrant. He was born in Ireland. He was a graduate of St. Benedict's Academy. He was closely allied with New Jersey's liquor interests, working with them to stave off prohibition and women's suffrage. Nugent loathed suffragists as do-gooders and reformers, intent on closing down the saloons and cleaning up municipal government. In other words, putting him out of business. At the time of the 1915 New Jersey referendum, Nugent paid a staff of lobbyists, speakers, and journalists to campaign against giving women the vote. Nugent's publicity agent was Edward J. Handley. This is not a picture of Handley, it's a stand-in, a reporter from the day. But Edward Handley was a well-known Newark journalist, and he planted anti-suffrage stories in local papers. He also maintained a vast army of clerks to address and mail anti-suffrage literature to registered voters around the state. As this illustration from Life magazine indicates, this is from 1915. Between 1890 and 1914, 11 Western states granted women the right to vote. I mean, so we sometimes forget that when we talk about women, American women getting to vote in 1920. That's when all women were granted that right. But before then, a number of states had given women that right earlier, mostly states in the West. And so to suffragists, this represented an unstoppable wave that would push voting rights eastward. What they little considered at the time was that most of these Western states were rural, were sparsely populated, had strong populist movements that supported votes for women, and lacked the entrenched business interests and political machines of the more urban industrial states of the Midwest and the Northeast. As suffragists pushed for state ballots in the eastern half of the country, they were in for a rude awakening. Between 1912 and 1916, 21 suffrage referendums were put to the vote, but only 6 passed. The anti-suffragists scored their greatest victory in 1915, when they defeated suffrage ballot measures in New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. And New Jersey held the vote first, 2 weeks before the other states, so this became the first big battleground. The anti-suffragists pulled out all the stops in New Jersey, since the election was being held there 2 weeks earlier than the other eastern states. They felt that a defeat in New Jersey might reverberate elsewhere, just like the pro-suffragists felt like a victory in New Jersey might reverberate elsewhere. In the run-up to October 19th, both the suffragists and the antis sponsored public meetings and rallies, and they flooded the state with partisan literature. The most common anti-suffrage arguments were that suffrage would undermine the family, that it would masculinize women, and that women were fundamentally unsuited for politics. So here's an anti-suffrage rally in Newark at the Kruger Auditorium, of course, the auditorium built by the Kruger beer money. This is an anti-suffrage cartoon from the Newark Sunday Call. It's entitled, "Where is Our Wandering Mama Tonight?" which depicted two lonely children sitting at their dining room table while their mother harangued crowds at suffrage rallies. So this is a typical kind of anti-suffrage argument that suffragists were neglecting their families as they gallivanted around to protests and to parades. The prospect of women's suffrage created gender anxiety for some men who felt that their authority and virility were challenged by the suffragists. They also argued that women would become unsexed, losing their femininity if they engaged in typical masculine behavior like voting. In Newark, the political boss James Nugent dismissed the supporters of women's suffrage as, quote, "a procession of long-haired men and short-haired women streaming across the Hudson River into New Jersey," right? You know, outside agitators. Nugent was confident that these gender deviants from New York City would be rejected by the sober-minded citizens of New Jersey. And this is another, I'll give you a couple examples here of sort of typical anti-suffrage imagery, this idea that political equality between the sexes would upend the world as people knew it, that these kinds of cartoons imagined that women's suffrage would lead to role reversal, where women wore the pants and lorded it over the men, and this woman's about to take off and enjoy herself. She's all dressed up for a night on the town, while her poor, you know, downtrodden husband is left doing the dishes. Or of course, this is what happens when women get their rights. This is on the morning of when New Jersey is going to hold its suffrage referendum. The anti-suffrage Newark Eagle published this humorous poem, which again, you know, this is only one verse of a very long poem that goes on like this for some time. So for some conservatives, women's suffrage was a zero-sum game. Women could not gain a political right unless men lost something fundamental in return. Another sort of argument is that politics was a dirty business, and that women's characters would become soiled if they participated in it. This is one of several poems published by the Newark Evening News the day before the suffrage battle. The anti-suffragists in New Jersey had powerful political and corporate allies, but we should not discount the appeal of their arguments in defeating the 1915 referendum. Anti-suffrage rhetoric mobilized diverse constituencies opposed to reform and social change, including urban working-class men who saw suffragists as busybodies intent on spoiling their fun. In New Jersey, women's suffrage was defeated with 58% of the state voting no, 48% voting yes. Newark had the biggest anti-suffrage vote in the entire state, with 65% of Newarkers voting no for giving women the vote. This is a cartoon which appeared on the front page of the Newark Evening News the day after by the great Newark cartoonist Luke Pease, in which, you know, gone, the ballot box is being held out of the reach of women voters who are being depicted as a little girl. This ward map of Newark shows the neighborhoods where the suffrage vote was the strongest and where it was the weakest in Newark. And if you, to orient yourself, the curve at the bottom of the map is that's the curve of the Passaic River. And the numbers that are circled are the numbers of the political wards. So 2 and 4, that's downtown Newark. Those are downtown political. 1, the old First Ward, that was the main Italian American neighborhood. And so the 8th ward that's mostly Forest Hill, that's North Newark. And that the 8th ward was the only ward in Newark that voted in favor of women's suffrage by a very bare majority of 51%. You also had strong support for women's suffrage in the 11th ward, which is Roseville, where 49% voted for it. These North Newark wards were more middle class, they were more Republican, and they were more native born than Newark as a whole. The wards with the strongest anti-suffrage vote were in the Iron Bond, as you can see in the South, the 5th, the 10th, and the 12th wards. These were all working class industrial neighborhoods with large immigrant populations. The 12th wards had the least support for women's suffrage in the entire state of New Jersey, with only 19% voting in favor of women's suffrage. That is, over 80% of that ward voted against giving women the vote. The 12th ward was predominantly German American, and significantly, it was the location of most of Newark's breweries. The immigrant ward with the strongest pro-suffrage vote was the 3rd ward. You can see there, where 43% voted for women's suffrage, and the 3rd ward was overwhelmingly Jewish at that time. To give this is a very crude, and I do emphasize a very crude, rough estimate of the ethnic vote in Newark based on those wards with strong, predominating ethnic groups. The difference between the Irish American, the German American, and the Italian American votes are not that great. Support for suffrage was significantly higher among Jewish Americans in Newark, though even they mostly voted against it. Enemies of women's suffrage in New Jersey savored their defeat of the 1915 suffrage referendum as the triumph of common sense over extremism. But their victory proved very short-lived. 5 years later, New Jersey ratified the 19th Amendment in 1920 by a comfortable margin, and women's suffrage no longer seemed very radical at all. So, I want to end very briefly by suggesting, what happened to account for this sea change? Well, World War I certainly played a big role in turning the tide in favor of women's suffrage. American women were widely praised for their war work in 1917, 1918. On the home front, making munitions, growing food, selling war bonds. And so women's contributions seem to be just as vital to American victory as men's combat role. Woodrow Wilson, right, New Jersey's Woodrow Wilson, the president, finally came around to endorsing votes for women as a necessary war measure in 1918. In 1918, the president pushed for a constitutional amendment giving women voting rights, and both political parties in 1918 added women's suffrage to their official platforms. Another issue is that the wartime rationing of grain supplies provided a patriotic cover for Prohibition, which was passed by Congress in 1918 and was quickly ratified by most of the states, not by New Jersey. So with Prohibition already enacted by men, the liquor lobby was pretty broken, and a key source of opposition to women's suffrage in Newark was no longer there. James Nugent, however, remained an implacable foe of women's suffrage to the bitter end, but this actually proved his undoing. Other Democratic politicians in New Jersey now saw suffrage as inevitable, and they hoped to cultivate women voters. In 1920, Frank Hague, a rising political boss in Jersey City, challenged Nugent's leadership of the Democratic Party in New Jersey over the issue of women's suffrage. When Frank Hague secured the necessary votes in the New Jersey Assembly to ratify the 19th Amendment, Nugent's political career was over, to the utter delight of Newark suffragists. All right, in conclusion, the leading opponents of women's suffrage in Newark were a motley crew, including among their ranks a rabbi, Solomon Foster, a corrupt political boss, James Nugent, and a society matron, right? Many society matrons, but society matron like Estelle Frelinghuysen. Under normal circumstances, these people were unlikely to have mixed much, and their motivations for opposing women's suffrage were quite different. They did, however, share a conservative vision of society and gender roles, and for a time were able to maintain an effective political coalition. anti-suffragist defense of the sanctity of the home against the supposedly corrosive effects of modern culture had a wide appeal. Although the antis were on the wrong side of history, their saga dramatizes just how threatening votes for women seemed a century ago. Okay, thank you all very much. I'm going to turn things over to Noelle, and we'll be available for questions at the end. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, George. I really appreciate that. And for all the folks who don't know, I worked on the exhibition Radical Women with both Dr. George Robb and Beth Sack-Cohen in the New Jersey room at Newark Public Library. Also, special thanks to the New Jersey Historical Commission for sponsoring giving us a grant for the research for this exhibition in order to empower and enliven the discussion for the vote in this election this year, as well as commemorating the amendment when many women received the right to vote. But as you know, we continue to face challenges as a country with regard to who has access and who doesn't. So my talk has, hi, someone will have to, I'm disabled from sharing my screen, so I'll continue to talk for just a couple of more minutes. So my talk is going to differ a little bit from Dr. Robb's in that I will discuss a little bit more about the planning of the exhibition, as well as the Black women and women of color that we profile in the exhibition. And so Radical Women Fighting for Power in the Vote in New Jersey is currently running at the Newark Public Library. And this is our poster, which is actually from the 50th anniversary of the women's suffrage vote. And it presents a very interesting image of an African-American woman and a white woman from New Jersey. The Black woman obviously dressed in a Black Power outfit, and the white woman dressed in a pilgrimage outfit. And it kind of raises questions about how we connect and who we connect to the suffrage movement in New Jersey. And then I also have an image from the show. One of the things that's essential as we think about voting in New Jersey and access to voting by various women and women of color, Native American women, Latinas, and other folks, is that this struggle has been both a local and a national struggle that has deep implications that pull from ideas about race, gender, sexuality, nationhood, and property ownership. And so at the local level, even before 1867, when we see the New Jersey Women's Suffrage Association, we also see the gathering of women. One of the things that often escapes folks in thinking about women and the vote is that basically in the early 1800s, women were not supposed to speak in public. Women really didn't own the property that they may have possessed from their families unless they were single. And we can see this in that the fact that originally, when the New Jersey Constitution was established, white women, African-American men, and Black women were granted the right to vote up until 1807, as long as they met the property requirement. And for women, you had to be single or widowed. And so in 1807, that right was taken away. And so there's actually an exhibition coming up in Philadelphia that examines this. So what we see with African-American and as well as women suffragists is this notion in New Jersey that is very unique to New Jersey, that the woman's right to vote in New Jersey has never legally been canceled. So this is something that Black activists, Black male activists, white women activists are really pushing in the dialogue in the early part of the suffrage movement. And so later on, we see organizations in New Jersey like the Women's Political Union in 1908. And then what we see are the various ways in which these groups, though they may not be connected directly to suffrage, they're all about amplifying the voices of women in New Jersey. So we have Miss Jarena Lee, who, though she leaves New Jersey, she was born here in 1849. She does the first autobiography of an African-American woman in New Jersey and in the country. We see an image of Lucy Stone wearing pants, which at that time was called bloomerism, which at that time was greatly disdained in our society. One woman, Mrs. Tillotson, wore pants in Newark, and she was detained because people thought that it was illegal. So what we have in the 1800s are women taking a stand for voice in community, and also beginning to work together. And so voting comes out of these various movements. And that's key for us to understand now in our contemporary moment, as well as then. And in the bottom, I have an image of the Newark Female Charitable Society, which is one of the second oldest women's organizations in the country that work to help poor people in Newark. The building still stands on Halsey Street. And so what is significant is that these local organizations then help us to feed into these national organizations. So for example, we see in 1890, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and then we also see Black women in response to the negative perceptions of Black women. There's the formation of the National Association of Colored Women in 1896, which then becomes the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. We also see this transition from looking at the issue as a state issue to a national issue, which then brings greater implications about race, since even though racism exists in the North, as we'll see during this discussion, white suffragists in the North have to deal with the white Southern racists or white supremacist women in the South who do not want to see Black women with the vote. And then also, as organizing continues, we see debates about whether Black men and Black women should be whether if they're being granted the vote becomes a major division as far as between folks who were traditionally aligned. So over here in the corner, we see in the exhibition, Frederick Douglass and Stanton, who were initially allies, who then become almost adversaries, or we see this again with Douglass and Susan B. Anthony, who have a big split because they're very much against the whole concept of Black men getting the vote before white women, and Black men eventually do. So in this presentation, it's a little tricky because I've identified that there's a crisis, right, for African-American women in New Jersey and throughout the country. And it's a crisis that must be addressed by organizing in various ways and addressing various issues. And so what we see here is actually in the crisis, the NAACP, which was founded in 1909 in response to the Illinois race riot and lynchings of Blacks. They have an image where it shows an African-American woman weary from seeing that another African-American man has been lynched or person. The second crisis, again, is racism in the movement. We see this from the march in 1913 to DC, a white woman telling a Black woman to stay back. This is actually a scene that happened in Maryland during the procession from Newark or New York to DC. And so the cartoon, it's from the New York Tribune. It says, "Just like the men." In the corner, we also see something that we found during the research, which was the Colored Women's, the Colored Ladies Political Club, which was actually a minstrel show that was performed in New Jersey and other states, where it was a satire of African-American women and depicted them meeting as a political club and using all of these stereotypes and racist tropes. One of the things that's about this, and I indicated this in another talk, it's negative in that we see that minstrel acts and this type of racism in arts and culture is evident in New Jersey, but it also is evident that there was much discussion about what did it mean for Black women to actually be a part of this dialogue. And in another film by Oscar Michaud, I also saw that as a part of the conversation. So over here, we see in The Crisis conversation about that and this discussion. So we see that there are various folks who are contributing to the conversation and trying to figure out ways to address it, but also making the public very aware of it. So what happens, right, when you decide to do an exhibition like this, right, the 19th Amendment, and we are trying to push past the understanding of how the women's vote was won federally, and what it means for these Black women who are rarely discussed, who had participated in the movement. And so the framework is that we have to engage a framework that is not white supremacist, but that is a Black feminist framework that recognizes these interlocking conditions of race, sex, class, sexuality, and how it impacts our strategies and solutions for freedom. And it has to acknowledge that there have always been Black women activists. We've heard a lot this year about Sojourner Truth. The mayor recently erected with Project Empty Space a mural of Sojourner Truth by Broad Street in downtown Newark, and she's become one of the most visible symbols. But we have folks here in Newark who also contributed to that discussion. And so we have to, one thing that we really push in Radical Women is that women's lives they're overlapping and they're interlocking. So these are two images that we use in the exhibition of an immigrant woman who is being met at the dock to be engaged. It was called White Slavery and Prostitution. And women like Mary Philbrook, who unfortunately we didn't get to explore as much in the exhibition, address this issue, as well as Black women and other women, how to save other young girls, young women, and women who were trying to create better lives for themselves in the North and in the United States. And behind it, I have an image of a scrub woman in New Jersey who worked on a farm. So bringing in these stories of working class and immigrant women as a part of women's stories. The second thing is that women's organizing and activism is just not based in these local and national organizations, but there are also these networks that we may consider to be informal, such as prayer groups in the Underground Railroad Network or discussion groups that are also a part of the suffrage discussion. So for example, one of the things we discussed a couple of times in the exhibition is this Phyllis Wheatley Literary Club in Newark. And the club is initially formed as a discussion group, and also it becomes a social help group. But then later on, the leaders of the Phyllis Wheatley Literary Club also become organizers and a part of the Ratification Committee. So by taking a different lens, we're able to illuminate these stories that were overlooked. And then in the bottom picture is an image we've seen a lot before. And we actually think that the women in the image may be a part of the Phyllis Wheatley Society. So we see them here entertaining soldiers. And then another part of this exhibition, and as a part of understanding African-American women's stories, is to unearth, suppress, or hidden stories and allow those stories to speak for themselves. So it was essential for us to have Native American women's voices in the exhibition. Even when it included, we didn't have so many, we wanted to engage these stories as a part of the total dialogue. So when we look at how African-American women's stories have become or have been illuminated in the past couple of years, we definitely have to look at someone like Betty Livingston Adams and her book, Black Women's Christian Activism. It opened up a whole world of African-American women and New Jersey activists and community workers and helped us. Another aspect of Black feminist research, particularly with this exhibition, is it conflicts with what we think we know. So we have Brenda Morick here in Newark, who attended Wellesley College, and she's a writer and an activist for women's rights. So it goes against the stereotypes of how we think communities exist. And Brenda Morick, she spoke to various women's groups in Washington, D.C. and in New York, even though she really isn't profiled as a major suffragist. And it also provides a more authentic and fuller history of the context of the period. So many of these women were working to help folks who lived in houses like these, so that the push for the vote was to empower those voices. So it's not just a singular narrative in Newark of African Americans living in dilapidated conditions, but we have these groups of African American women who are working to empower African Americans in Newark. So many of Newark's African American suffragists were actually descendants of African American activist communities in Newark and other cities and towns in the 19th century. A lot of folks generally recognize the name Baxter from the Baxter residences, also from James Baxter. This is his daughter, Grace Baxter Fenderson. Please read, I put this so people could read for themselves and see. She was a Newark resident. She was the founder of the Newark NAACP chapter. She was also the president and chairperson of the executive committee of the NAACP. And she was on the board of directors of the Sojourner Truth branch of the Newark Young Women's Christian Association. And her father had been a part of the 1800s abolitionist community. Another woman who we were able to definitely speak more about in public with the exhibition is Blanche Harris. Dr. Robb was able to find more information about her. She's the president of the Women's Political Union Colored Women's Group. Now, what's interesting is that while we found a couple of sightings in the newspapers about Blanche Harris being connected to the Women's Political Union, in the Women's Political Union papers, we really do not see that much about the colored branch of the Women's Political Union. So it's a very interesting dynamic. It clues us into what the relationship was with Black women in these white groups, and when Black women wanted to maybe work with them or be affiliated with them, some of the challenges that came with this. Blanche Harris had a rooming house also on Mulberry Street. Another thing we see with these African American women activists, and she's also an actress. So second, the other part is that Newark's African American women suffragists were mainly migrants from the South that resettled here in Newark and other places, but contributed to organizing here. So we have folks like Musette Brooks Gregory, who moved to Newark with her husband, who's a lawyer from Harvard. And it's extensive, the work that Musette Brooks Gregory did here in Newark, as well as in New York. But she exemplifies, again, these women, these African-American women who are working on multiple struggles, multiple issues that are intersecting in their lives. So they're working against lynching. They're working to protect young working class African-American girls. They're working with the NAACP. And later on, she joins the New Jersey Suffrage Ratification Committee. And she is very much a leader here in Newark, New York, and also Washington, DC. And so I also want to include Bertha Washington, who worked on the Young Women's or the Young People's group of the NAACP. And I put, this is an article that I recently wrote on the incredible legacy of Newark's Black women activists. And you can find it on Zocalo Public Square. And this image is pretty powerful. It has Brenda Morrick, it has Bertha Washington, and it also has other national folks like Grace Johnson, who was the wife of James Weldon Johnson, who wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing. And so it's really interesting when we go through these documents to see the different activists who came to Newark, who worked with folks in Newark, and you see people like Matthew Henson, you see people like Du Bois who are coming to the Urban League meetings, who are meeting with these women. So these women are working locally and they're working with national and international figures to address issues within the Black community, but also larger issues. And then we see folks like Florence Randolph and Violet Johnson, who lived in Summit, but they regularly worked with women and men here in Newark to help establish a home for migrant girls. And they also took leadership in the Ratification Committee. So we see that folks see art and use art as a fundamental way to engage community to begin this political organizing. I discussed the Phyllis Wheatley Literary Club a little earlier. And so they had their mission to promote literature. And these women, Musette Gregory, as we already discussed, and Arminta Douglas, they become the leaders later on. Major leaders like Addie Waits Hunton would come to Newark, and she was a guest of honor. She was also regularly meeting with them. So what we see is that the women would use these organizing opportunities or these literature clubs to explore larger political issues and also to educate the people who were leading in their community. Just as I wind down, we also see here that the New Jersey Federation of Colored Women's Clubs was founded in 1915 by Florence Spearing Randolph. And we see at their first convention that the themes are temperance and women's suffrage. And so as early as 1916, we're seeing the formation of groups with this at the center. Another aspect is this radical motherhood. So this concept that, again, that we spoke about of younger women and protecting younger women as a part of the what we would now call women's rights movement in tandem with getting the vote. So women working, activists working through Urban League and other coalitions designated space for migrant women in the first Phyllis Wheatley home and later the Sojourner Truth branch of the YWCA. As we close out, this what we see is that this deepening the multiracial organizing is the strategy that folks use to win. And so in 1919, Lillian Fikert of Plainfield reaches out with other folks, the New Jersey Women's Suffrage Association, in engaging Black women communities with the New Jersey Women's Suffrage Ratification Committee. This becomes big news because it is an interracial coalition to elect folks who support, will support the 19th Amendment, and then later on continue to support the rights of women. And so we see a sharp turn, and this is a very significant move here in New Jersey, since women like Alice Paul and other women were often struggling with what they felt was their response, their need to have the power of white Southern women in order to achieve the ratification of the amendment. So as we go forward in the exhibition, we're able to highlight women of color and other folks like Hilda Hidalgo, her campaign for Essex Freeholder in 1965, and then also our own councilwoman here in Newark, Mildred Crump. We see that some of the issues that Councilwoman Crump are issues that the women dealt with when they were organizing their communities prior to realizing the 19th Amendment and even after. So one of the things that's just important as we continue, as we engage folks in the exhibition and just going forward, are that achieving the vote and voting are all a part of the different ways that women achieve justice. And that's all I'll say for now. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Noelle and George. Those were great presentations. So the first question is for George. We had a comment from someone and Beth tried to address it a little bit, but I want you to give you a chance to respond. Noelle's presentation indicates a significant African-American population in Newark during the suffragette movement. However, the racial breakdown of the previous speaker, meaning you, George, showed a zero African-American population during the same period. I'm not sure that's really what it showed, but perhaps the previous speaker could clarify that?
Well, I was talking about the people in Newark who were against getting women to vote, and those were pretty much all white people. So, which is true, right? So there certainly were most of the Black people in Newark were pro-suffrage, were in favor of women's suffrage. So obviously I wasn't talking about them because what my focus was on were people in Newark who were against giving women to vote.
I was thinking, George, that he was referring to the slide with the Italians, Germans, Jewish.
Oh, right. Well, I wish I would be able to. So the problem in 1915 is the African-American population in Newark in 1915 was about 4% of the population. So 96% of people in Newark in 1915 were white. And there weren't enough Black people in any given area to know how they voted. So there were some Black people in the 3rd Ward, there were some in the 2nd Ward, there were concentration of Black people in the Ironbound, but there's no one political ward that was predominantly African American. So unfortunately, I couldn't gauge what the African American vote was. Other information that we have would indicate that Black people in Newark, as elsewhere, were much more pro-suffrage than the average person. And so, but unfortunately, there aren't electoral returns to show that, which is too bad.
Okay. So, Noelle, there is a question here I guess you should answer. The reaction of Black women suffragists, the white women who opposed the movement, dismantles their perception. How does this utterly dismantle the reasons that barred their ability to vote and reclaim their identities? I'm not quite sure what is being added. Can you maybe address that? Talk about that?
I'm not sure specifically what the question is. So is the question, I don't know if the person can be unmuted. I don't know.
Okay, well, maybe we'll give her a chance to clarify what she's,
Okay, great.
and then we'll ask again. So this is for Jubilee. Jubilee, if you have something to add to that to make it clearer what you want to know, then just type it in the box, okay?
Okay.
So question for you, George. Do you have any information on how Black men voted in 1915?
Right. So that's similar to the other question.
Yeah.
Not from the wards, because there wasn't enough of a concentration, but the indication we have from other kind of sources, other literary sources, is that Black men were pretty pro-suffrage. So so Black men, probably like Jewish men, were probably the groups in Newark that were most pro-suffrage, for all kinds of obvious reasons. But
yeah. So I have a question for both of you about your research methods. Noelle, you first. I know you did a lot of research for this exhibit, and you uncovered some kind of interesting things that not a lot of people knew about. What were some of the places you looked, some of the sources you used? Talk about that a little. Talk a little bit about the research that went into the exhibit.
Yeah, thank you for that. So one of the things I kind of alluded to in the beginning of this discussion was finding information in the crisis. So for example, there aren't that many images of Grace Baxter Fenderson, even though her family was so prominent here in Newark. But in the NAACP crisis newsletter, she was on the executive committee, so she was a part of that. We did a lot of reading and rereading, and yes, like going into, in another panel, I discussed how, like, say, to find out about immigrant women, and organizers, we had to look through organizers' newspapers, and, you know, the usual research tactics of going through the footnotes, looking at things that might have been hinted at, and then exploring them further. But I definitely had to give a really big shout out to Betty Livingston Adams, because without her work, really giving that secure foundation to begin to ask more questions in a different way, it would have been hard to identify folks. And of course, Dr. Robb and Beth did a great job in securing some folks like Blanche Harris.
Beth did great research. Yeah, we really need to give Beth some credit for this. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
But yeah, Beth did a lot of great research.
Okay.
Yeah. She's a librarian. She knows how to do that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so 1919 was momentous in other ways too. What was the role of the pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic, in changing New Jersey from being anti-suffrage to pro-suffrage? The war was not the only thing that intervened. Can one of you address that?
It's a good question.
Maybe not.
No,
okay, that's a good question.
But I have no idea.
Anna Flaherty, yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you have any clue, Noelle, about that? Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. I don't have any clue.
Yeah. All right. You'll have to speak to that at a future meeting, Dan. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Another program. Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
Yeah. What was the relationship between New Jersey white and black suffragists in the march from New York and Newark to Washington, D.C.? Some of the state delegations excluded black women, didn't they?
Yeah. Yeah. Why don't you talk about that, Noelle?
Yeah, I'll speak on it a little. Actually, now it's interesting because, and George can correct me if I'm wrong, that as far as the march to DC, it was comprised of various people. So it was not just folks from New Jersey. I forget even the number that are from New Jersey. I think it might be 4, because I feel like it's like 4 from New Jersey, maybe 3 from New York. So it's a small group. They envision themselves as pilgrims. And so when the African-American women first make that point of connection, I believe in Maryland or South Jersey, those are actually in a different state. So that action did not occur in New Jersey. And the most we hear about African-American women trying to be a part of the 1913 march is the stories of the Deltas, and the Deltas deciding to participate in the march, even though they were asked to march in a segregated section. And of course of Ida B. Wells, who was asked to march apart from the Illinois delegation that she came from. And she, you know, stayed kind of like on the sidelines. And then when her like I forgot what they're called, cotillion, or when the group got closer to her, she stepped out and joined them in protest. So as far as African-American women's participation in that march, there isn't like a strong New Jersey action. It's actually from the women in DC and then Ida B. Wells, but who knows, we might find out something more.
Yeah, sure. So why do you think it has taken so long for us to begin hearing these stories about the differences between Black women and white women around the whole issue of women's suffrage? I mean, it really wasn't until very recent years. It's not something the general public has really heard much about. I mean, maybe in academia they've been talking about it for a while, but it hasn't really been something that's gotten talked about much in kind of popular histories. Not until very recently.
Right.
Why do you think
I would say a little bit about that. The women's suffrage movement is pretty interesting, is that the leaders of the movement wrote their own histories while it was still going on.
Yes.
And so Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote a 3-volume history of the women's suffrage movement in the late 19th century, in which they basically talked about this movement that they had led. And they really emphasized themselves, and they wrote out people they didn't like. So like Victoria Woodhull, who was a radical, a sex radical, and was embarrassing to them. So they just totally eliminated her from their history. But in 1920, after the 19th Amendment was passed, a 4th follow-up volume to that history of the women's suffrage movement was written. And they asked a prominent suffragist in each of the 50 states or the 48 states to write the history. So for New Jersey, it was Lillian Fikert from Plainfield, who was the head of the main women's suffrage organization in New Jersey, which was a white women's organization. And Lillian Fikert wrote this history. And for example, she completely wrote out Alice Paul, who she didn't like, who was a radical. And so she just like pretended like she didn't exist because she didn't like her. And she didn't talk about Black women either, really. I mean, she mentioned Randolph as like, oh, well, she was on this committee, so they mentioned her in passing. So I don't think Lillian Fikert was a racist. She had invited Florence Randolph to be part of the executive committee. So she was reaching out to African-American women. But it was just like, well, she was sort of talking about the people she knew the most, who were, you know, women she knew, and she wrote about them, and the other people she just didn't know that much about or didn't think they were as important. So I guess the point I'm trying to make in a long-winded way is that the history of the suffrage movement was written by white middle-class suffragists who mostly talked about themselves. And so historians for a long time just based what they were doing. They went to those sources and they looked at that and kind of accepted that as a story. So it's only more recently when you have a lot more African-American historians, frankly, who are looking at stuff, who are starting to say, hey, let's maybe tell a different story and look at other sources, that people start to dig up and find out information about a lot of these interesting African-American women who just never made the history until recently.
Yeah, and I would just like to also say, I mean, another part of this research is looking at like common facts that really are like lies. So, you know, I mean, even in national publications, people always associate Susan B. Anthony with Seneca Falls, and Susan B. Anthony wasn't even a part of the Seneca Falls. But here in New Jersey, especially with our story about Black and white women and African American women losing the vote, I mean, we had to go through lots of discussions and look at various essays for something that actually only ends up being three sentences in the exhibition. And because usually it's depicted that because of what the women did, they lost the vote, you know, whereas, you know, with other scholars examining it, we see that it was first intentional to write women into the Constitution to get the vote. At first, some folks used to always say, oh, that was something that happened by mistake. So first, scholars had to establish that it wasn't something that happened by mistake. And then the fact that it was taken away later, which was seen as something because of ideas about frivolous women and all these other things, and to see that it was intentional as far as wielding power over who gets to vote in New Jersey and who doesn't. So it's fascinating, and I think that's why I had to include the Black feminist framework in this discussion, is because we have to have a framework that acknowledges that there are certain power analyses and frameworks or ways of looking at things that are in place that are blocking us from the truthful history, right? And the truthful history is Lillian Fikert trying like multiple times to get the African American women to work with her in the Ratification Committee. And them really having to come together and think about that and reflect on working with these women who, you know, were trying to like work with white Southern women who did not believe lynching needed to be addressed or that Black women could vote, you know? And so there are so many different barriers keeping us from the truth on how we built democracy in New Jersey. And yeah, it requires various research strategies.
Okay, I mean, this would be to point, I would encourage anyone who hasn't seen Noelle's exhibit, it's going to be up for a few more months, to come to the Newark Public Library and see it, because I think local history is an important way to include more stories about African American women and immigrant women and working class women, because these national histories of women's suffrage have been around for a long time. It's always like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, these national leaders, and they'll say, oh yes, in Sojourner Truth, we'll throw in a few Black women, but it's the same old people again and again and again. Whereas if you look at the local level, if you look like at a city like Newark, you start finding all these people who no one's ever heard of, including a lot of Black women who are like down in the trenches doing important work, but who just never made it into the histories because they either were not nationally known or the people who were writing these histories didn't know them or didn't care about them. So that's why an exhibit like Noelle's is really important, because when you start looking at the local level, you can recover a lot of these really interesting and important people.
Yeah.
And that exhibit will be up until at least the end of the year on the third floor of the library, 5 Washington Street. George and Noelle, thank you very much. Back to you, Tim.
Yeah, this has just been a splendid evening, showing the value, as George says, of local history, the opportunity to focus and bring different perspectives and to bring other stories to light. And that really is, it was done splendidly tonight by both you, George, and Noelle. Thank you so much. It's why the Newark History Society was formed some 17 or 18 years ago to give voice to these stories and to keep finding them and telling them. The next meeting of the Newark History Society will be a program jointly sponsored with NJPAC, and we're calling it Monumental Newark. And Guy Sterling will talk about Gutzon Borglum's Seated Lincoln. And Gordon Bond will discuss his Wars of America in Military Park. And we feel that program is quite timely. This has been a period of great discussion about monuments, the role of monuments and how they should be viewed, particularly since the death of George Floyd at the end of May. And what we want to do with this program is to look at these key monuments in Newark, understand better why they were put there in the first place, what the intent was and how they have been viewed, not only at the time, but over the years, and bring that into discussion. That's going to be on November 9th. The information about it is on the Newark History Society website. And those of you who are on the Newark History Society mailing list will certainly be getting more information about that. And Tom, our next meeting with you will be in January, and it'll be about the Morris Canal. So we have a number of good programs coming up over the coming year. And George and Noelle, you have gotten us off to a fantastic start. Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for tuning in.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you and good night.
Good night, everyone.
Have a good night, everyone.